appointment in ecology and evolutionary biology and an affiliation with the applied physics program. So I sort of stick my fingers in a few pies. But fundamentally, today I'm going to talk about one specific piece of the work I've been doing with my group for a few years now. And this is related to the study of a class of hybrid systems called event-selected systems. And so hopefully I will sell to all of you the importance of this class in making our lives much simpler in handling multi-contact problems, which appear in many important places in robotics. But to make sure I don't forget the people who deserve the real credit for this, I'm going to start with that. So a lot of the work here was done in collaboration with Sam Burton, who is now in University of Washington and was a grad student with me back in Berkeley, where we started working together. These ideas took a long time to build. A lot of the key results were also done by my grad student, George Council, who's now at Forge Robotics. The actual robot was built by Taylor Claflin, who is now in USC. And the key results that I'll get to at the end of the paper are the work of my current grad student, Marian Anderson. This has been going on for years, so there are many funding agencies that contribute in some way or another to this work, and they all deserve credit. So I run the Bio-Inspired Robotics and Dynamical Systems Lab, which has the misleading name of the Birds Lab, because although it's bio-inspired, I do almost nothing at all that's related to flight and nothing that's related to birds, but all the other cool animal acronyms were taken. We work on a bunch of animals. These are some of the animals we worked on. We do all sorts of applied math methods that I will cover some of, and we build a whole bunch of different robots. I think I probably have more robots in my lab than most of the robotics labs do these days. I would have loved to include a little bit of horse work that we did that's related to today's talk, but it's not going to have room. So the horse has the dashed outline of my regret, but I will be covering basically one robot and one bit of the theory that we do. So what are these event-selected systems that I'm talking about? Well, let's first talk about what are hybrid systems. I assume that in a control audience, almost everyone here will know what hybrid systems are, but they're sort of a state machine that has an ordinary differential equation for each state. That's at least one broad way of defining hybrid systems. So the state space is partitioned into domains. The domains have boundaries that are codimension one manifold, or surfaces called guards. You have some smooth behavior within each region, but when you hit a guard, you have a discrete transition to a new dynamical system. And this is really important for robotics because contact generally changes the equations of motion. If my finger is on this table, there's a different constitutive equation for the dynamics of my hand than when my hand is up in the air. And so contacts in general are modeled by guards, and typically one guard per contact. But in general, we use hybrid models in robotics at least, to deal with phenomena that physicists would call collisions. What's a collision? It's something fast and complicated that we don't want to think about, but that has a predictable outcome. So if you've taken a physics class and you talk about an elastic collision, you know from conservation of energy and conservation of momentum what the output will be. You don't need to work out exactly how the two things that hit each other are going to warp and wobble and eventually move apart, because you have a way of predicting the output of the collision from the input, and we can avoid a lot of complications that way. We can avoid dealing with the fact that rigid bodies are an abstraction of something that doesn't really exist in the real world, that material interactions are limited by acoustic propagation rates, there are plastic deformations, there are surface interactions, lots and lots of different things that can happen when one thing touches another that we can ignore by treating it as a collision in a hybrid system. And I started looking at these sorts of hybrid systems related to locomotion with sort of classical models like people use for say, bipeds, where you have a leg hitting the ground and you have a change in equations of motion. But then I had the misfortune of being an actual experimental biologist, so I had to deal with this. So if you look at these animals moving around, you'll see something unfortunate, which is look at the three legs. Bam. Bam. Three legs touching the ground almost at the same time. That's not that neat system that we're hoping for. We don't just have a single guard that the leg is crossing. We have three guards that are crossed almost at the same time. And the typical behavior of the animal in these multiple contact gaits is that the periodic behavior is going through a region that contains the intersection of multiple guards. And that was very annoying because as we went to the literature, we discovered that basically no one has handled this case. So there were some folks who handled the intersection of two guards, and that was about where it ended when Sam and I started looking at this. So we tried to look at different types of hybrid dynamics overall. And the most general type of hybrid dynamics is if I have two different events that can occur, the red event and the blue event, maybe the red event occurred first, that's one, and then the blue event occurred, and so I have one followed by two. That could be one sort of dynamical outcome. And two followed by one would be a different dynamical outcome. That's the general case of a hybrid system. The history of the discrete transitions can actually change your outcome. At sort of the other extreme are the sort of multi-contact models that are often used by people doing mechanical simulation, where they use what are called complementarity systems. They're saying, okay, here's one force that occurs with a contact, another force that occurs with a contact. And so if I go from the force before contact, I get force plus A if it was contact A, force plus B if it was contact B, and force plus A plus B if both of them have happened. But now the dynamics here are completely determined by the dynamics here. I have no freedom for what might happen. Event-selected systems exist in a world in the middle. The world in the middle is the world where the dynamics are selected by which subset of events has happened, but not the order of the events. So you lose the history of which ordering of events happened, but you can still have something here in 1 and 2, which is not just the sum of the effect of 1 with the effect of 2. So there are a broader class of systems in that sense. And that's pretty important for modeling some kinds of transitions, though I will say some of the results I talk about today are only going to be relevant for that additive case. So we're basically dealing with a situation where some limit cycle behavior, some periodic behavior, if we're talking about locomotion, illustrated by this yellow line, is going through the intersection of two surfaces. And what's important about that is small perturbations can switch the contact sequence, can switch the order in which the events occur. Now you think, okay, well, this seems like a weird special case, but the difference between knowing which subset of events and which history of event happened becomes really important when you have lots of contact. So here's something most of you have probably done in your life. You caught a basketball. You have 10 fingers, most likely. And when you caught that basketball, you went from no fingers to all fingers on the ball without really thinking about it. Well, if the order didn't matter, there were 1,024 contact states. Still a lot of equations to deal with. But if the order did matter, there were 3.6 million sequences possible, which is much, much, much worse. And so the complexity of control going from a general hybrid system down to an event-selected system can be a pretty big simplification. Another way to think about this difference when applied to mechanical systems is that there's a double limit problem when we're thinking of multiple contacts formed at once by rigid bodies. We can tell ourselves two stories. In one story, a contact is formed, then the body returns to its rigid shape, then a contact is formed, then the body returns to its rigid shape. Or we can tell a different story where all the contacts are formed, and then the body relaxes to its rigid shape. So this is basically a double limit. There are two limits here. The limit of relaxation of the body to its rigid shape, which is a fast process, and the time difference between the events, which is also a fast process. And depending on your view of which process is faster, you get a different solution for the physics. Illustrated otherwise, imagine this robot with two spring damper legs approaching the ground. A leg hits the ground. It can't actually penetrate the ground, so it will relax. And in the rigid body result, that information gets propagated through the entire body. So the effects are really felt by the whole body before the second touchdown. It turns out that this sort of model mechanical engineers have been using for a long time, and there are a whole bunch of papers, including by folks who are formerly here, like David Remy, which show that really bad things can happen in these rigid body collision models. You can have discontinuous dependence. You can have inconsistent results when you're modeling kinematic trees. The rigid body assumption and collisions don't make good bedfellows. A different way of thinking about it is sort of a soft body result, which says both legs compress, the leg effects are independent. In this case, the influence on the center of mass will actually be additive, so that's even easier than the general event-selected case. And the kind of system you're going to get is going to be an event-selected system. So as I mentioned, the mathematical properties of these sort of indeterminate transition sequence problems were not really studied beyond two possible contacts or transitions. And so I'll go a little bit into the mathematical properties of event-selected systems. But to prepare for that, I want to tell you about an important class of functions that we usually aren't familiar with and don't teach about. And these are called PCR functions. PCR functions are continuous functions that are made out of pieces. Each piece of the PCR function is a CR function, is a CR smooth function. So for example, you can take two CR smooth functions, f and g, and if I take the pointwise maximum of these two functions, this new function, which takes the maximum, is PCR. Each piece comes from a CR function. Because I'm doing a pointwise maximum, the transition is always continuous. It turns out that just doing pointwise maximum or pointwise minimum can't actually create all PCR functions. That class is broader than what you can just generate with pointwise maximum or minimum. But you can already see how this would be a useful class of functions to study for optimization. And indeed, some of the literature about these functions were developed by people studying optimization problems. And so we'll use these here. So I'm going to go into a bunch of slides that will have the frightening math text from the actual paper. I'm not going to intend to explain it. Was there a question?
Yeah. So I was curious about, in terms of transition, is there any smoothness assumption on that?
There's no smoothness in the contact. You get a corner. Okay, that is in fact exactly the point. So event-selected systems are basically systems where we have some region with some point that is on the intersection of multiple guards, that point rho here. We have smooth dynamics in each of the regions. And we have one additional condition, which is that with respect to the functions defining the guards, so locally I can define the guards with just being level sets of some function, proper level set. With respect to those functions, the Lie derivative is strictly positive, is bounded from below for all of them. What does that mean in practice? All the events will happen, and they will happen with a lower bound on the time. That is, I know that they will happen with certainty after waiting long enough. So it's the case of catching the basketball. I know all my fingers will eventually be on the basketball. The question is just in which order. So one of the quick things we can do with a system like that to simplify it is let's rewrite our system with respect to the touchdown times on the different manifolds. So instead of writing with the original coordinates, we can hallucinate rewriting the system where now our coordinates are just how long are we before or after each event. It turns out that if we have enough guards, that gives us a full coordinate frame, but now our guards have become the coordinate hyperplanes. So our life is a lot easier already. But something else happens, because if we want to understand what's happening in this region, and all of these are smooth functions, we can sort of zoom in more and more. And when we zoom in more and more, smooth functions approach constant functions. And so what we end up with is a piecewise constant vector field on a standard arrangement of hyperplanes. This is a very rigid and restrictive set of conditions, because what happens in each of these regions, if I think about what happens to the state, is really, it's undergoing a linear projection, right? It's entering a region, traveling a constant vector, and hitting a hyperplane. So the local effect is just a projection in each region. And this becomes very important. Why is this important? Because in the land of control, what we love more than anything else is being able to talk about infinitesimal changes to our trajectories. And that means we really want first order approximations to the flow. That is, we have the flow of states along time, and now we want a first order approximation and a fine approximation for the flow.
These are oblique projections, right?
Depending on whether I have rectified the coordinates or not, the hyperplanes here will be oblique, but these are always oblique. They're along the vector field. And the vector field, because of that Lie derivative guarantee, is always diagonal. Okay, so the standard kinds of first order approximations we have are obviously the derivative, multivariate derivative that all of you know about. Or sometimes we also look at directionally differentiable functions. And this is sort of the definition of a directionally differentiable function. That is, we have some direction h, and our directional derivative here gives us a good approximation for what happens if we come closer and closer in the direction h. It turns out there's a slightly more general kind of derivative called the Bouligand derivative. The Bouligand derivative says we have a limit that looks like the directional derivative, but the h can change direction, and we still want the limit to exist. So what happens in the case of Bouligand differentiable functions is they're always directionally differentiable, but as it turns out, they don't have to be classically differentiable. They don't have to have a conventional derivative. And the theory of PCR functions tells us, and that goes back to the question from the audience earlier, PCR functions end up Bouligand differentiable everywhere. That is, they have this sort of first order approximation at all points, even though they don't have a classical derivative. And this is really powerful because that first order approximation turns out to have an implicit function theorem associated with it, and a few other nice sort of results from analysis that normally we wouldn't get for functions that aren't smooth. So now that I've introduced that, I can say what our key results are. It turns out that event-selected systems have a unique PCR flow, which is Bouligand differentiable. This is almost as good as having a smooth flow in the sense that we have first order approximation around all trajectories. The impact
question, just so I have the right mental model. If I take the absolute value of x, it's a scalar function. It's not differentiable at the origin. What would this derivative be? It's piecewise continuous.
Yeah, so the derivative here is the directional derivative of the absolute value function.
If I go in the one
so it's one in all directions is what it is. Which is sort of different than a normal derivative where if I'm one in one direction, I have to be going -1 in the opposite direction. A unique flow exists. It's written here in integral form because we don't have a conventional derivative. I can't write a conventional ODE here. The impact times are defined and they're PCR as well, so that if I take a point and I ask how long will it take until it hits a guard, that function itself is PCR. And it turns out that a unique maximal flow exists. So really there is a solution to this ODE, which is something that's not immediately obvious for non-smooth systems. There are non-smooth systems that don't have a unique solution. So that itself is actually quite valuable. It turns out the result is even stronger. There is a PCR rectification to a flow box. That is, the dynamics of an event-selected systems are actually very simple in terms of the topology. It's just parallel transportation in a weird set of coordinates that puts kinks along the trajectories. So because we know that the flow map for a fixed transition sequence is going to be a composition of trajectories, it's going to be linear. So if I am looking up the diagonal of a cube, so imagine this is one set of edges of the cube, and this is the other set of edges of the cube that's further away. I'm looking up the diagonal of the cube. I have transitions on X, Y, and Z. Each sequence, there are 6 possible sequences, X, Y, Z, X, Z, Y, etc. Each sequence is going to take a set of initial conditions and transport them into some final conditions. And that transportation is going to be linear because it's a composition of projections. They're going to meet continuously on the boundary, but beyond that, I have absolutely no guarantees. So I have the circle of initial conditions, and this is what we did in the simulation. You can get this weird sort of Frankenstein ellipsoid, which is stitched together from different pieces of ellipsoids as your output. But it's still a first-order approximation. Seen again in a different way in 3D, circle of initial condition, transitions on X, on Y, and on Z. And if we look down the diagonal, you see that we started with an ellipse, and we ended up with some weird Frankenstein composition of ellipses. So that's what event-selected systems do. It's somewhere in between what smooth systems do and what general hybrid systems could do. The other really nice result, which is very, very important for control theorists, and we sometimes forget, is this result, which is structural stability. That is the result that says, if my model is slightly wrong, my dynamics will be slightly different, rather than my model being slightly wrong and my dynamics will be drastically different, which is possible. So for example, Hamiltonian systems are not structurally stable. If you perturb them in the space of smooth systems, you can get something that's completely different, right? Energy could decay, explode, all of these things. Event-selected systems under small perturbations in the derivative and the vector field actually give you a topologically conjugate dynamic. That is, they're basically giving you the same answer. If you have a small error in your model, you get a small error in your prediction. Drawn sort of graphically, I have my perfect say actuation within event-selected systems. I have different vector fields in different domains. I start with a circle, I end with some Frankenstein ellipsoid. If I were wrong about all of these, but it's still sort of qualitatively the same, I'm going to get a blob. I can't get something that's not a blob on the output. I'm going to get something that's topologically similar to what I got before. Okay. So let's dig a little bit deeper into this issue of what happens if we perturb a state for an event-selected system. That is about stability of event-selected systems. So for smooth systems, all of us have had to suffer through some kind of ODE class where we're taught about orbital stability, where we can write a linear time-varying system along a trajectory, and that linear time-varying system governs how perturbations evolve next to that trajectory. That is basically what we have up here. Now, for hybrid systems, people have understood this for a while. Something weird happens when you go through a guard. And the weirdness there has to do with the fact that the vector field can have a corner in it. And the corner in the vector field, the difference between the vector going in and the vector going out, expresses itself on the variational equation that governs perturbation using something called the saltation matrix, here indicated by xi. So I take my perturbation before the hybrid transition, delta x minus, and I need to multiply it by the saltation matrix that governs that discrete jump that happens as I go through the guard. And what is this xi? Well, it's the identity plus a thing, and that thing is fundamentally the change in my vector field exterior product with a vector perpendicular to my guard, rescaled appropriately. Okay, so it's almost an identity, but there's a correction in the direction that sort of crosses the guard. And if I have a bunch of switching events, I just need to do a product of these xi's. So you can imagine that this is sort of what happens in these event-selected systems. I'm going through a transition sequence. Each time I'm crossing through a guard, I'm going to hit a saltation matrix like this. But the nice thing about event-selected systems is that we were able to show, and this sort of stands to reason, is we could also think about what happens in the event-selected system by making a sort of minimal model of it, which is this piecewise constant vector field that happens when I take the limits, the planar limits of all my guards and the corner limits of all my vector fields. And now I have a piecewise constant vector field in an arrangement of hyperplanes. And it turns out that that's a better way to compute these quantities, because the problem with this Bouligand derivative, as we discovered when we started trying to build methods to compute it, is although the number of pieces is not combinatorial like it would have been if we were dependent on history, it's still exponential, which is still really, really bad computationally. And so instead of trying to compute the whole object that represents this Bouligand derivative, it makes a lot more sense to have a rapid way of computing what the Bouligand derivative does to a perturbation. And that turns out to be pretty easy using this corner vector field. In fact, it's so easy that this is all a fit. So this is one of those weird papers you sometimes get in mathematics where the result is 11 lines of Python code, but the proof why this works is 40 pages. That's it. This will compute perturbations going through an event-selected system. Why is, or what's an example of doing this? Well, so we did an example problem. We have a sort of multi-legged chair bouncing on the ground. It hits spring dampers. Why do we want spring dampers? Because the velocity is going to generate a force immediately. So you don't have a force that builds up from zero, because we already know that elastic collisions are going to make smooth systems. So nothing interesting is going to happen there. We need the force to start from something non-zero immediately after contact. So we write this system, and we write its equations, and we simulate it with a conventional simulator that detects the events and does ODE integration in each domain. And we compare that to the simulation that is just going to use this event-selected approximation of running through the projection sequence. And so for a two-legged chair bouncing on a spring damper ground, we ended up being about 1,400 times faster. And when we went for a three-legged chair in 3D, it ended up about 43,000 times faster. So this is a big qualitative difference in terms of the performance of our simulations. Right? This is taking a system that was sort of hard to simulate and bringing it back to the speed of simulating a smooth system, pretty much. And so this was very encouraging. This was work done by George, and then Marian followed up with that by writing a general purpose event-selected system integrator. We have it working, and if you want to beta test it for us, please talk to us. But just to give you a sense of what this looks like, so we have our guards. We add a little bit of secret sauce here, and the secret sauce is this. We ask that our guard functions also have the following property with respect to the vector field. When the guard is less than epsilon, the second derivative of the vector field has to be sufficiently small. So the vector fields have to be kind of constant when we're sufficiently close to the guards. And you can adjust the scaling of your guard function to represent that. So basically, it's another bit of information we ask our designer of the simulation to put in. But with that information, we can do the following. I'm close to a guard, I project to that guard. I simulate, I'm close to another guard, I project to that guard, and then I continue. And that's very, very fast. The proof we have in our current paper, which is on the archive already, only shows that this is going to be a first order integrator, but we expected it to be a second order integrator based on the general theory, and indeed the numerical tests seem to support that. And you see that when we compare to commonly used mechanical simulator MuJoCo, our trajectories and their trajectories look very much the same, except we wrote this in Python and it runs just as fast. And theirs is an optimized C++ simulator that's specifically for mechanics, whereas this is a more general class of systems. So hopefully this tells you, okay, something interesting is happening with event-selected systems. But another interesting thing happened when we started analyzing these systems and really sort of surprised us. So let's go back to mechanics. Imagine a second order system, which is typically what we have in mechanics. So some q double dot equals f of q and q dot. But now let's say that our events only depend on position. And furthermore, that they generate forces that are additive. So this is the case that everyone else is doing with complementarity systems, but we're just formulating it differently. We define our saltation matrices after transition sequence sigma and crossing guard K. We'll call them P sigma K. And now the behavior for our entire system will just be the product. So I should be a bit more precise. Our saltation matrices are identity plus that P. We write this product out, and each transition sequence sigma has this product. But we can expand this product, right? We can just expand it. The first element in the expansion will be I. The next element will be the sum of these guys. And then the next element will be higher order terms of products. But it turns out that P sigma I and P sigma J are always orthogonal to each other. So all these higher order terms drop out. And this was pretty surprising to us. What it ends up is we only get the sum term. And why is the sum term important? Because the transition sequence doesn't matter at all. By the time we went through all the transitions, it's just the sum from 1 to n. So this means that this class of mechanical systems is actually C1 smooth, and no one realized it. Because it's not smooth. It's just C1 smooth. It's only continuously differentiable, even though we started out with arbitrarily smooth function. And that was pretty surprising. And so when you see something surprising like this that should have impact on how things work in the real world, it's not enough to show that you have a surprising mathematical result, because at least the robotics community doesn't care. If you can't actually build something with it, then they don't care. You want to show that it actually works. So we tried to build a robot that would have 3 independent hybrid transitions by making these 3-legged hoppers. So they kind of land at almost the same time. But we quickly discovered something pretty annoying about them, which is that we need dynamics that go from before collision to after collision that actually depend on the state before collision. But all our robots actually didn't seem to do that. If we take these robots and drop them on the floor, they don't bounce back up. What really happens, even though this looks like nice hopping, is that all the energy is lost in the collision and the PD control of the motors. And with the energy, we also lose the history of the state, right? Dissipation is the same as forgetfulness. And so instead of having a robot that is an example of our system, we discovered that it's really hard to make a hopping robot that's an example of our system. So we built all these different approaches to try and make hopping robots. So initially we thought, oh, maybe this is friction with the ground. So these guys have toes that slide on the ground. These guys have little wheels. That didn't help. Then this one was a little bit better with the wheels. It has stiffer springs. Then we figured, okay, maybe this is not it. Maybe we need better springs. So we built parallel pairs of springs with different kinds of spacers between them. This is high-speed video of different kinds of legs hitting the ground. The leg on the left has spacers between the springs so that they can't buckle into each other. The leg on the right, you see that they do buckle towards each other, all in this attempt to try and make something that stores the energy in elastic storage and returns it, that has some continuity of state through the collision with the ground. And after many desperate attempts, we did this experiment, which finally helped us understand what's going on. So leg 1, leg 2 attached to the base, leg 3 attached to the motor. So what does this tell us? That PD control is doing its job and destroying all the energy. That's what it's telling us. It turns out that series elastic actuation is really bad for what we're trying to do because the motors have good PD controllers. So the D term is taking all the mechanical energy out. And we can't tell it not to do it. So we came up with this guy. This is parallel elastic actuation. The legs are hitting the ground. The robot is bouncing back up purely mechanically. Now that it's in the air, we realize the cables are slack and we pull them taut and preload the springs with some energy. So this robot design, unlike all the previous ones, restores about 44% of its energy hop to hop. So it is an actual example of the system we want to study, where there are multiple collisions and the state before the multiple collision is actually carried through by the dynamics to what's happening after the collision. And so that means collecting a lot of hopper data. So this is an example of hopper data. We have some markers on the toes. We have some markers on the body. We can see the body Z bouncing up and down. And these are the distances between the body and each of the toes. So you can see that the system is basically working. And now we wanted to analyze these data. So here's what we want to show. We want to show that each of the legs is doing something different. Otherwise, this is not an interesting event-selected system, right? If all the legs are identical, it's at least harder to imagine why you wouldn't have just a C1 output. It turns out it's actually not guaranteed. Even if the legs are identical, you're not guaranteed to have a C1 output. But it's a lot harder sell than if I show you that each leg is just doing something different. So how do we show that? Well, we need to show that the affine models of the flow generated by each individual leg are meaningfully different. That is not just statistically significant in their difference, but actually significant in terms of effect size. You will see the robot do something different with different legs hitting the ground. But that by the time all the legs have acted, a matrix derivative exists for the flow map, and it works for all 6 contact sequences equally well, i.e. the system is C1. It has the same derivative for all contact sequences. So that's the goal. There's another catch here. because that means we want to compare linear models with different domains. I created an example of this to show you why this is tricky. So here we have two different linear models, the blue line and the red line, and we're measuring them in a noisy way. The problem is that if we just tried to fit data to all of this, they don't have an overlapping domain. If we tried to fit data just on this side, the uncertainty on this side is large. If we tried to fit data just on this side, the uncertainty on this side is large. So we can't reject, we might not be able to reject the possibility of the same model applying even when there are different models. Our sensitivity is poor. So how do we improve the sensitivity of this kind of test? Well, we can improve it by taking the data and reflecting it into the other domain or translating it into the other domain in such a way that we would expect to have a continuous, or not say continuous, a linear function throughout the whole space, or in this case, we have both of these in the same domain, and now we can see, oh, they have different slopes. Whereas we couldn't reject the data points of one from the other if they were on different domains, because the domain amplifies the uncertainty inherent in the slope. The difference between the domains amplifies our slope uncertainty. So that's one kind of methodological problem. The other problem is, right, the data sort of looks like what you have on the left, right? There's just robot bouncing around. You sort of want to normalize it so you're always looking at hops going through the same coordinate frame so you can make them comparable, so you can really carefully write the flow. And there's the problem of just even how do you detect the touchdowns in these data, right? So here is our actual data of the z coordinate of the body. So the head position with respect to the position, and the other axis is the position of the foot, where none of the legs are on the ground and when all of the legs are on the ground. And why do we try and use that? Because we're trying to find a threshold which is consistent amongst all possible contact sequences of here we're certain that we're fully in the air, here we're certain we're fully on the ground, and now we can look at the map from fully in the air to fully on the ground and see if it depends on the contact sequence. And so there's a lot of statistical work there. So here you see a bunch of, this is from the actual data, pre-impact point, post-impact point. Here the coordinates are the time to impact. Time to impact coordinates rectify everything into a flow box because we always move 1 unit of time per 1 unit of time. So the derivative is all ones. It just lets us see the flow and see that we're actually occupying this region through the intersection. We're not skewed into one domain or one contact sequence too badly. And we're pretty good at decoding the landings. So this is an example of actual samples. These are velocities of the feet. See, gravity's rainbow. Velocities just has constant negative derivative. And then the leg hits the ground, and we can identify that to within basically a time sample of at 100 hertz. So pretty accurately. And so we can build these maps. And we've tried to build these maps. So each leg, we build a model of the map it is predicting for the state of the entire robot. So if I'm landing on leg 1, what is the affine map that's governing the behavior of the robot? And then I'm comparing what happens if I use the map for leg 3 to predict what happens with leg 2 hitting the ground, et cetera, and so forth. and we get differences. I'm not entirely happy with this. So we're getting to the part where we have some incompleteness. But that's the basic approach to show that each leg is different. Then to show that our total least squares regression of the affine model is actually significant. How would we show that it's significant? Well, one way to show whether maps are the same or different is to think of them as sort of hyperplanes in the space of maps and look at the distances between these hyperplanes using something called the geodesic distance. And we do that sort of analysis there. I don't want to get too deeply into it, except to sort of present to all of you, there are sort of gnarly statistical methodological problems in showing this experimentally, but we're slowly making our way through that. And I think we'll have a result. So what have we learned? We've learned that multi-contact mechanics can be modeled with event-selected systems. That's not the only thing that can be modeled. For example, there was a student a few years ago who used ESS to model power systems when transformers switch states. That's also an event-selected system. ESS models can be integrated much, much, much faster than other forms of the same kind of dynamics. And to our great surprise, event-selected systems where force changes are based only on position are actually C1 smooth. And that means that the conventional linearization results that we all know and love from our classes should work unmodified, even though these systems seem to be discontinuous at first sight. So that's what I wanted to tell you all, and thank you for your patience.
Other questions? Yeah, so thank you for a really interesting talk. You were talking about how you really worked hard in the experiments to design an experimental setup where you had a relatively high coefficient of restitution on impact so that you preserve the state. But you did also mention that I think you said you conserved about 44% of the pre-impact energy. So I wanted to, and admittedly, I don't understand all of this, but I wanted to understand a little better what you meant by preserving the state, because you are losing apparently 56% of the incoming kinetic energy.
Yeah, so thinking of a kinetic energy as sort of a norm of the difference between states, because it is in a sense a norm. In a perfect world, I want a system that's, of course, energy conserving and I want a really low measurement noise, but I'm always have this fight, right? I want to make sure that whatever is preserved is substantially larger than my measurement error. Okay. And I wasn't there before.
The reference.
The reference is what is my measurement error? And before we're basically at a situation where we couldn't know anything about the previous state by looking at the next hop.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm trying to understand the linearization. Suppose I have a second order mass spring damper, and let's say the damper is linear, but the spring is nonlinear. And that's suppose the spring is like this absolute value function. I'm trying to linearize about the point where the kink is occurring. So if I do a conventional linearization, like the derivative doesn't exist. So like mentally, I'm not even sure what linearization you're getting out of this.
So you're talking about the sort of first part of the talk where I'm not saying it's C1, I'm just saying it's Boulegan differentiable, and you're asking about that?
Let's say the mass is 1. So I have x double dot is minus bx dot linear damper minus f of x. So the last statement on your last slide is that's a dynamical system where it's the force is piecewise continuous if I say the position is only, the spring part.
Yeah.
And there is a valid linearization. And you're
saying I can do a conventional linearization and it will work.
So,
or maybe I'm misunderstanding
how you're phrasing it.
So
just on the previous slide, I guess you had one bullet point about conventional linearizations.
Yes, if the force changes are based only on position for your hybrid transitions, And so in your case, what are the alternative transition sequences? They're just one?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so for that system, you didn't need anything I did, right? You're going through this hybrid transition and you're going to have a saltation matrix. And that saltation matrix is going to tell you how your perturbations are going to evolve differently once you've had the transition. So you have one smooth domain, you cross the boundary on the guard, your perturbations are hit by the saltation matrix, and then they continue on the other side.
Okay, so the linearization is not, my mental model is you're going to get one second order linear differential equation that models this everywhere. You're saying no, what you should think about is there's a second order linear differential equation on the two sides of the manifold, and you have a linearization about what's going to happen as you transition through.
This is what happens with a single guard.
I have a question about the simulation you show on the two-legged chair.
Sure.
So you mentioned that we have like these two limit competing whether the event is faster or the contact sequence is faster.
Yeah.
So this projection, my understanding is that this projection is only valid when the contact is like very fast, like sequentially. And I was curious about like.
Sure. So what we're trying to solve here is the case where the two events are very, very close. Because if the events are far apart, then the answer I gave Pete already is the answer. You go through the first event, you're hit by the saltation matrix. You go through the intermediate state where one leg is on the ground. You have another event, and then you continue.
So the situation here is that maybe you rotate the chair a little bit. The one leg will hit it first and go through a transition, and then the other will hit.
Yeah. And the question is, what happens with small angles, right? When the angles are fairly small, you have this trajectory, which is a sort of mathematically singular, which goes through both legs hitting exactly at the same time. And around that trajectory, classically, you don't know what to do, right? You don't have a derivative. So is that trajectory stable or unstable or some weird thing in between? And we give an answer to that question.
And kind of follow up on that, how do you like analyze how close you can use this projection, or like is the angle?
Well, so this is a great question, and it turns out that PCR functions and their Bouligand derivatives obey this sort of standard Taylor expansion kind of results. So what's going to happen is, depending on what you want, worst case analysis, average case analysis, what sort of analysis you want to do. But let's say worst case analysis, you pick your error bound and you want to look at all possible directions and find out which one is the worst. And all possible is, of course, hard to do, but we can tell you that the number of pieces that make up this Bouligand derivative is unfortunately factorial in the number of transitions. That is, you are actually going to have all possible transition sequences appearing typically. And right now, I don't have a better answer for you than try this factorial number if you want to do your worst case analysis, which is not very satisfying, but that's where we're at right now. But at least it's a finite thing. You can do a loop. Okay, it might take a long time, but you can at least explore all of these. Whereas if it was purely continuous, you'd need to do some sort of nonlinear search for the worst case or something like that. Yeah.
In terms of catching ball, the example you have for 10 finger, is it fair to say instead of like there are 10 guards, you should probably think of like 2 guards, 1 hand for each? That could simplify the simulation.
Well, so if you believe that the multi-fingered case is a position-dependent guard, which I believe it is, then we're actually saying it's going to be C1. And so you could just take our fast computation, compute D+1 initial conditions, do a linear regression, get that derivative, and you're done.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One more question.
Yeah.
I guess I just had a broader question, especially as this applied to robotics. I'll
and I'm going to ask the question that you said robots is asked. So when you think about these systems in the context of like event selected systems, what kinds of like robotics problems, get that like speed up and like all the benefits that you're mentioning, and what kind of problems remain, unhelped by thinking about it in this context? And I'm talking about, I guess,
well, I mean, to man with a hammer, the world looks like a nail, right? So I'll say what we designed this for was primarily trying to think about multi-contact events, which is why I was using that language interchangeably. So a lot of the work I do in my lab is trying to figure out this weird tension where in nature I see lots of things with many legs and roboticists hate building them. Why is that? And the things with many legs are usually very stupid. And so I can't believe that their control is difficult. So I'm trying to find out what are various ways in which multiple contacts are easier to work with. So it looks like multiple contacts are easier to work with than we realized. And this applies to multi-legged locomotion and to multi-contact grasping and things like that. Where would this not work? I don't know how to extend this to any kind of continuum problem. I don't know how to deal with situations where the assumption of rigidity is meaningful. Okay, if you want to solve what happens when a steel bar hits a table, I don't think I'm going to help you much.
Well, let's thank Shai again. Be stupid is better. Oh, this one's hot.